murderers and rapists and thieves. Trump is constantly talking about all their crimes. And the reality is, and it's irrefutable, that immigrants and recent immigrants and undocumented immigrants commit violent crimes at a much, much lower rate, far lower rate than people who were born in the United States. And so the state of Texas would be a lot safer if you deported all the people born in Texas. And if you just left Texas to the immigrants and the undocumented immigrants, there'd be a lot less crime.
If you went and got a burger from a fast food joint, it's likely that you make certain assumptions. It's not that good for you, a lot of fat, a lot of salt, but at least that beef has come from a cow. That cow ate grass and it saw the sun at least once. Well, Eric Schlosser's expose of the fast food industry, published in 2001, called Fast Food Nation, has bad news for you. That burger's probably got bits from as many as 1,000 different heads of cattle from 5 different countries, all ground up and combined into that patty that you're eating. What's more than 80% of beef samples found evidence of fecal matter in the meat. So maybe, just maybe, you bit off a bit more than you could chew with that order of a Big Mac. Personally, I think Eric Schlosser's work has been criminally misidentified. He often gets stuck with the label of anti-junk food campaigner, but his work is actually much more interested in working conditions than it is in salt and fat content. Fast Food Nation and his later work like Reefer Madness often starts from looking at changes in workforce composition, how they're treated in the factories, what their jobs actually are, and then examines all the downstream consequences of that in terms of our own consumption habits. I hope you enjoy the interview, especially the random tangent where we address whether or not he's a Marxist. It really was an eye-opening conversation. Eric Schlosser, welcome to Downstream. Thank you so much for joining us. Fast Food Nation, it's now a Penguin modern classic. There are still facts in there which shock me every time I come across them. And for the uninitiated, someone who's never even thought about what goes into their food before, how did this book come about for you?
So I had spent a year following the harvest in California, and what I was really interested in was the exploitation of undocumented workers as migrant farm workers in California. The governor of California, this is in the early 1990s, was Pete Wilson, a Republican, who wanted to be president of the United States and decided that demonizing and scapegoating immigrants and undocumented immigrants in California was going to be his ticket to power. And he was arguing, and the Republican Party in California was arguing, that undocumented immigrants and recent immigrants were parasites, that they were welfare cheats, that they were coming to California to live off the hard work of California residents. And instinctively, I knew that that was false. And I became very curious about what was the actual role of undocumented immigrants in the California economy. And at that time, this is before the major tech boom, agriculture was still the number one sector of the California economy. And there'd been a huge increase in high specialty crops like fruits and vegetables that need to be harvested by hand. And that's where so many of the undocumented immigrants were now working, for extraordinarily low wages in terrible working conditions. So I followed the strawberry harvest throughout the state. And strawberries are one of the most profitable crops per acre, like $1 million per acre in revenue. But they're very fragile and they're very difficult to harvest properly. So if you want to produce a lot of strawberries to make a lot of money, you need a lot of hands. And I tried to show the big lie that the Republican Party and Pete Wilson were telling the people of California by getting into a very complex story of labor history, farm labor, economics, immigration history, but telling it all through something very simple and concrete, the strawberry that people eat all the time without ever thinking about. So that was a big investigative piece that I wrote. And the editor of Rolling Stone read that and said, we'd like you to do the same thing for fast food that you did for the strawberry. Show the whole world behind the counter and the systems that bring this fast food to you. And I did not jump at the assignment because I didn't want to write something that was condescending toward the food that most people eat. And I'm not a foodie. I'm not a gourmand. If someone makes me a really good meal, I'm so grateful. But I don't really care that much. I mean, I try to eat healthy, but I don't think about food. So what was interesting to me is I started researching the fast food industry to see if I wanted to take this assignment. And I was just amazed at how powerful it had become, how transformative it had been in a very recent, brief period of time in terms of, food production, labor relations, culture, et cetera, et cetera. So then I took the assignment. But what I try to tell people now, and I hope it comes across, particularly in the afterword, the new afterword to Fast Food Nation, is it's really not a book about food. It's a book about America. It's a book about the rise of unchecked corporate power in America as seen through the prism of food. And you could tell that same story through many, many other industries because a handful of corporations have taken over almost every industry in the United States. But food, you could argue, is the most important industry because of how it affects the landscape and workers and diet and health.
I mean, I want to come back to your findings about the
Yeah.
fast food industry, but this is kind of my theory about your work, which is that whether it's Fast Food Nation or whether it's Reefer Madness, so much of it has at its starting point a kind of workers' inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a method that I would associate with Marxist sociologists who are
Mm-hmm.
in the academy rather than with journalists. So, how did you cultivate your particular method of starting with the workforce, looking at its composition, and then growing and growing in terms of the lens?
I mean, my background academically is history, and I never set out to write nonfiction. I started out as a playwright and was unsuccessful. And then I was a novelist and I was hugely unsuccessful. And then I had the beginnings of a career as a screenwriter. And I really didn't do any nonfiction writing until my early 30s. And I was so frustrated with the independent film world and really saw that I would have to be a director in order to make sure that my work was not fucked with. And I didn't really want to be a director. So I tried to write nonfiction journalism, but in doing so, I wanted to write stuff that was old school investigative reporting, not celebrity based, not. And I love some of this writing, but it's not about me. It's not. It's never been about my journey through the world of fast food, or I'm working on a book on prisons. It's not going to be, my journey into the depths of the American prison system. It's very much, centered on the lives of other people. And why the worker emphasis? Because that's what I care about. And I've been very privileged and fortunate to write about things that I care about. And
But where did that
and
come
I'm going
from?
to
I
push
mean,
back. I'm going to push back a little bit about the Marxists in the sense that, an interest in workers' rights isn't solely a Marxist interest. And I read Marx extensively when I was at university, and I read Edward Bernstein, Evolutionary Socialism, and I read Lenin, and I read, the great anarchists Kropotkin and Bakunin and Proudhon, and trying to figure out my own kind of worldview, particularly in studying history. As a graduate student, I studied the history of the British Empire, trying to understand, you know, uh, its driving forces and its collapse. And after all that reading in classical sort of left-wing um, theory, I came away with a kind of a rebellion against theory. And especially, Marx was a brilliant historian and had tremendous insight into the economic forces at play in the 1830s and 1840s. But as a prognosticator of the future, he was totally shit. And how could you expect him to predict the future? But one of the things that he introduced a number of things that to this day I'm really troubled by. A sense of inevitability, a sense that events are unfolding according to any preordained stages. He also personally was really authoritarian. And the way that he wrote about and talked about other people who cared about the working classes, but who deviated in small ways from his own thinking, was really bitchy, really nasty. And I think he introduced into left-wing thought a form of discourse that you can still see to this day of any deviation from any kind of position is an apostate.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's a lot in Marx that's interesting and valuable. But one of the things that's intriguing to me, and I don't know if you're a Marxist, but I'm curious, once you call yourself a Marxist, you're sort of making your own thinking subservient to that of someone else. And why can't somebody just think for themselves with lots of different other thinkers who they've read, and then try to look at the world through their own perspective? And particularly, this is an issue for me because in trying to fight for social change, as I have on a lot of different issues, getting people to work together can be really challenging. And when some people have really rigid views that aren't maybe tolerant and forgiving of people who maybe are slightly different in their views, it makes it much more difficult. So are you a Marxist?
Well, I'd describe myself as a non-dogmatic Marxist. I'd say I'm a Marxist in that I think society is composed of classes which have mutually exclusive and antagonistic interests, that social change occurs when one of those classes gets big enough and bad enough to challenge the one that's above it. But in terms of the Marxists who've been most influential in my thinking, obviously the white heat of the Communist Manifesto is important, and you can feel the excitement of Marx and Engels as they're writing it, right? It's a very literary kind of text. It's drawing a lot from Victorian sensationalist literature because they want it to be exciting.
Beautifully written.
I love it. But when I think about what the task is for people who would consider themselves Marxist in some way, I think about a brilliant essay called For a Marxism Without Guarantees, which is a sort of criticism of, I suppose, the idea that you treat Marx like he was an Old Testament prophet who's coming down from the mountain and he's revealing how the truth is going to unfold. And your job is to take these texts and overlay them onto society and go, the signs are in alignment. So that's how I would describe it.
But to push up against you, why in 2026 feel to describe yourself on the basis of an economist who was writing in 1846? Were his insights so much more unique than other materialists of his time? And particularly once societies kind of had Marx and Lenin as their idols, and the authoritarianism that I think really is in Marx's own writing becomes so tied to societies that call themselves Marxist, why can't we just let go of labels? And you're talking about classes. Like, even one of the real challenges I found when I was reading Marx is how do you even define these classes?
And he never does. He famously doesn't define the working class.
But so why? I mean, is that the central motive force of human history?
I think in terms of mutually competing classes, yes, where you can sort of say, all right, I can.
And are they economically defined, or would a class be gender defined, or would a class be? I mean, I'm not going to persuade you. I'm just trying to have a conversation. I mean, it's just one of the things that the huge challenge for me in starting with, as you correctly noted, at the heart of so much of my writing has been social justice for the workers at the bottom of society, particularly immigrant workers, and trying to find a way in the 21st century to not only fight for that, but to articulate the need for it and the kind of pathways for change in a way that's forward-looking and not stuck in 19th century or even early 20th century language and frames of reference. And I'm going to make one more point and then I'm going to shut up. Another issue, so I told you that my graduate thesis was on British imperialism and the British Empire. And even the way that imperialism and colonialism is in the year 2026 discussed is so hugely influenced by Lenin's essay on imperialism. Lenin's essay on imperialism, and I know this because this is part of my area of specialization, is historically completely inaccurate and flawed, and was based on an essay called Imperialism by J.A. Hobson, who was writing about the Boer War. Mm-hmm. And I wrote about the Boer War in my graduate thesis. And it blows my mind that left-wing thinking about colonialism and imperialism in 2026 is still influenced by an essay in I can't remember when it was, maybe 1905 or something like that, that's dealing with economic forces that are so out of date in so many ways. And anyway, so I don't want to get into an argument about theory with you, but I'm just trying to push for 21st century thinking about exploitation, injustice, and particularly when it comes to immigrant workers in America right now, terrorization. And how do we move forward free of the jargon and I think some of the outdated thinking of the past on the left? And now I'm gonna shut up.
Well, no, but the thing is I'm not gonna, launch my defense of, Lenin as a strategist and tactician, and I'm not gonna go into this is why the footnotes in Capital are actually really important.
Oh God!
Though I do think Karl Marx would have loved Twitter. He would have been addicted to it. He would not have been able to resist sort of atting Adam twos and being he would have been one of those people that really significantly worsens their own mental health by tweeting too much. But I think coming back to the thing that you're saying, which is about the centrality of workers' rights and workers' conditions, and why I think about that as something which comes out of a Marxist sociological tradition, right? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily Marx himself, although, Engels did that a bit more. But thinking about that as something which comes out of that tradition is that there is a relationship between the intellectual work you're doing, the research that you're presenting, and a possible form of political organization. And I suppose this is something I wanted to ask you about Fast Food Nation, is that you talk about the monopoly concentration, the concentration of ownership, the concentration of production in American agriculture, also UK agriculture. I can think of some big strikes, the 2021 Frito-Lay strike, but despite there being this huge potential for disruption if workers were to withdraw their labour, it doesn't seem to happen. I've not heard of a massive dairy strike or, a massive beef production strike. What are the forces which have allowed this kind of monopoly concentration, but not having a kind of mirror in union organization, militancy, density?
Yeah. So, meatpacking as an example. The novel The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was written because Sinclair was a socialist and he saw the slaughterhouse as the perfect metaphor for the ruthlessness of American capitalism. And slaughterhouse workers were terribly, horribly exploited and abused, which he wrote about at length. And they were largely immigrant workers. And again, when there were efforts to form labor unions, one group of immigrants were pitted against another. And it was incredibly difficult to form labor unions as a result. And when there were nascent labor unions forming in the meatpacking industry, black workers were brought in from the American South as strikebreakers, again, pitting one group against another. Beginning around the 1930s, remarkable success in unionizing meatpacking workers. So that, and this is a story I tell in Fast Food Nation, by the mid to late 1960s, so 60 years or so after The Jungle was written, the meatpacking industry was fully unionized. And what had been one of the worst, most low-paid, dangerous jobs in America had turned into a union job with high wages, benefits, and literally could provide the basis of a middle-class life. So it was an American success story in many ways. And Sinclair was writing about something called the Beef Trust, which was like the monopoly that controlled the meat industry. And by the 1960s, it had been broken up. And there was real competition between meatpacking companies. And the biggest company controlled, maybe 20% of the market. The top four companies controlled a total of 30%. So you had progress. You had unionization. You had a terrible, low-paid, brutal job turned into a solid middle-class job. And then
And were there commensurate improvements in workers' safety?
Yeah, because there were unions, and there were very strong unions. And then you had a revolution in meatpacking, not a revolution, a workers' revolution, but you had this company that began recruiting immigrant labor, that began recruiting undocumented immigrant labor by, running advertisements in Mexico and also running a bus service to Mexico to bring in workers. And within a very brief period of time, within about 10 to 15 years, you had the major unions either broken or neutered so that they still were representing workers, but they really, had no power. And it's just, it's a tragic American story of things getting better and better and then getting worse. And one of the things that I find so offensive right now in the United States about how immigrant workers are being demonized and scapegoated and literally being hunted down by paramilitary forces with like automatic weapons is that this transformation didn't just occur. It occurred because big, powerful corporations were allowed to recruit undocumented workers and exploit them. And the enforcement has been directed at the workers and not at the corporations that have profited the most. And in this modern economy, having a worker whose immigration status is uncertain is the ideal way to have a powerless worker who is going to be afraid to complain about working conditions, who is going to be afraid to join a union drive because they could be turned over to the authorities. And in a very brief period of time, which the book chronicles, you have, a job that becomes a terrible, dangerous, low-paid job once again.
In a recent piece you wrote for The Atlantic, you quoted a former leader of the Proud Boys who said, "We didn't vote for cheaper eggs, we voted for mass deportation and we voted for retribution." You've described the way in which undocumented immigrants have been scapegoated for the policies and the decisions of corporate elites. I suppose that sentiment of a desire for retribution, how representative or not do you think that is of the median voter and their political desires?
I think that the viciously racist, anti-immigrant, white supremacist segment of the American population, the hardcore white supremacist racist, is maybe 10% of the electorate, maybe 15. The hardcore Trump MAGA is probably 25 to 30. And then there are, to use an old-fashioned phrase, fellow travelers who have all kinds of angers and resentments, who will vote for Trump because he's a disruptor. So 40% of the adults in the United States right now are supporting really reactionary policies with various degrees of enthusiasm. But again, I mean, I have had the great privilege of almost all the nonfiction writing that I've done has been set outside of New York City, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. And it's not good for the climate, but it's been very good for my work that I drive. So when I'm trying to understand what's going on, I'm driving from town to town. And I can't boast about knowing the United States like the back of my hand, but I've driven all 50 states. And the anger is totally justified and legitimate. And what's happened to rural America is appalling. And the way that, it's been depopulated, the way that it's been, economically exploited to the benefit of the big cities is legitimate. So Trump has drawn upon a lot of anger that I think has a real basis. But, it's so sad that that's been used to support kind of a quasi-authoritarian fascism. And I fault, in many ways, the left for having abandoned and ignored such a large segment of the American population who logically and rationally should not be supporting the policies that they're supporting. And it's I'm not a Democrat. I don't think I've ever been a registered Democrat. I'm not a Republican. And I think there really is a need for a new kind of, I even hate to use the word politics because I hate politics, but a new movement that draws its power from sources very different from what the Democrats traditionally have. And I've worked with Bernie Sanders, and I think of all the American politicians that I've had to interact with, I have by far the most respect for him. I don't agree with him on everything, but there's a farm worker group that I've worked with for decades in rural Florida, which has some of the worst working conditions in the United States. Central Florida has much more in common with Mississippi than it does with coastal Florida. And there are, cases of human trafficking and many cases of slavery in which undocumented immigrants are essentially sold to representatives of growers and working for free. And this is a group that I was working with for years, and we invited Senator Sanders to come see the working conditions. And he showed up there without a press person, without an aide. He just showed up. He spent hours and hours with us in the fields in really hot, miserable conditions, wearing his blue button-down shirt that is characteristic of it. And there's every morning, at 5 a.m., the workers would gather in a central square in a ritual that could have been from 1820 and would raise their hands as the bosses and the foremen would pick out workers because they're basically day laborers. And he wanted to see it. And he got up at 4:30 in the morning, showed up. And so, and there are people who genuinely care about these things. And I have enormous respect for him, but I don't have enormous respect for the Democratic Party itself. And it's really, especially on the issues that I've written about, it's just been such a challenge getting members of Congress and the Senate to engage on them. And I've been very fortunate that I've written about things I care about, and then I've gotten engaged as an activist. And there have been a handful of elected officials who I've worked with who I've really respected. But for the most part, both of these main political parties in the United States have been corrupted by money. And what they say to get elected is often hugely different from what they do once they're in power.
You talked about the amount of travel that's been involved in your work, and I was wondering if you've ever returned to some of the places that you write about in Fast Food Nation. You wrote about Greeley in Colorado in the
Yeah.
book and talked about the way in which dairy farming has evolved over
Yeah.
time. And of course, this book's published in 2001. Like, did you ever go back to Greeley between 2001 and now? And if
Yeah.
so, how have places like that changed?
Colorado has just continued to gain population and in some ways has become more and more prosperous. It still has, the packing house in Greeley. I went back there and, would see workers who I wrote about in the book and ranchers I wrote about in the book. And in the afterword, I wrote about Greeley. It's just crazy because the slaughterhouse that I write about at length in Fast Food Nation became ground zero for COVID in 2020. And a local health official shut down the slaughterhouse because the workers were at such high risk and there were no protective measures being taken. And President Trump issued an executive order basically forbidding local health departments from shutting down slaughterhouses. And it was all because of this same slaughterhouse that I'd written about in Fast Food Nation, which was pretty weird. That executive order that President Trump issued was written by the legal team at Tyson Foods, the biggest American meatpacking company. They changed the language somewhat, but the first draft was written, which just shows you how closely in concert these big companies are working with these elected officials. The largest meatpacking company in the world, JBS, which owns that Greeley slaughterhouse that's at the heart of Fast Food Nation, the section that I care the most about, was the single largest donor to the Trump-Vance inauguration. So, so many of the things that I wrote about in the book not only continue to this day, but are worse. I mean, significantly worse.
How did you feel when you first saw Trump and RFK Jr. embrace "Make America Healthy Again" as a slogan? Did that campaign ever have any meaningful content, or was it always just smoke and mirrors?
I dislike Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Intensely for many, 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 many reasons. And I think that he's profoundly dishonest. And I give him credit for one thing. He had the political instinct to understand that Americans care about these food issues and was willing to speak out about them in a way that most of the Democratic Party was too fearful to ever do. And in dealing with members of the Obama administration, for example, President Obama was trying to get passed food safety legislation that would give more money for inspections and empower the Food and Drug Administration. And I was arguing, no Americans support contaminated food. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. And Teddy Roosevelt understood that. Teddy Roosevelt was responsible for the first food safety legislation. And yet the Obama administration finally did champion the Obama administration finally championed this food safety legislation at the end of their term during a lame duck session of Congress, and they got it passed, but they never got it fully funded. But there just has been an unwillingness in the mainstream of the Democratic Party to take on the big food companies, the big agribusiness companies and the fast food companies. So I give Bobby Kennedy credit for understanding that could be a viable political issue and using it, but it's completely and totally a smokescreen. And if you look at the language of the MAHA, Make America Healthy Again report, some of it just feels like it could have been plagiarized from Fast Food Nation or from a documentary that I helped to produce with Michael Pollan called Food Inc. I mean, they've taken so much of our language from this movement to transform the American food system, and behind it, they've done nothing. I mean, the real achievement that Bobby Kennedy so far has done in the food realm is he's persuaded some ice cream makers to voluntarily remove artificial food dyes, which, great. It's a total co-option of the language. And it's, on the one hand, it's absolutely infuriating to see these words being used as a cover for the deregulation of the meatpacking industry, the deregulation of the pesticide industry. We can just, the destruction of the public health system of the United States. At the same time, the encouraging and hopeful part is seeing that the American people overwhelmingly support healthy food for children, not having highly processed, ultra-processed foods in the schools, et cetera, et cetera. So, the potential is there for someone who really, really wants to make change to do it, and it's just been exploited. And what Bobby Kennedy has done to the public health system and for vaccines, not thousands, probably tens of thousands of people are going to die. And those who are being most affected are the most vulnerable. I mean, children, people who are immunosuppressed, people who have different chronic illnesses. And, there's a measles outbreak right now at an immigrant detention center in Texas. And it's madness. But it's a form of madness that's extraordinarily profitable for certain big businesses in the United States right now.
I want to come back to the work you've done with undocumented immigrants, but just to stay on ultra processed foods for a second.
Yeah.
In 2001, we had an idea of what junk food looked like, and you would think of fries and Big Macs and milkshakes and fizzy drinks and all that kind of thing. And now the category of ultra processed foods, sure, it includes some of those things.
Yeah.
It also includes low fat yogurts and pre-packaged high protein stuff.
Yeah.
Is there an uncomfortable truth, which is that for somebody who wants to eat well and to be certain that the burger they're eating isn't from thousands of cows or it's not been stuffed with God knows what chemical, that you have to spend a lot more money and a lot more time cooking. And that particularly for women, there's a side of it which can be quite reactionary, which is if you really care about the health of yourself and your family, you need to be a trad wife. You need to be returning to these gender roles.
am constantly embarrassed by the fact that I can't cook a thing. But I think a lot of the traditional gender roles are evolving. And so I know a lot of men, and I know a lot, particularly younger than myself, who are just amazing, in the kitchen. So I think the expectation that women have to be the cook, hopefully, is vanishing.
But there is a
You
sort
can,
of
you can,
cultural trend of like the trad wife, and it's big on
yeah, but
social media and
I
stuff
think
like
that's
that.
separate from from the healthy. Let's talk about ultra processed food for a second. I think that there's a hierarchy of how bad this stuff is for you, and something like a low fat yogurt without too many strange additives, it's not going to be that bad for you. And in fact, the fact that it has live and active cultures is probably really good for you. But then there are all other ultra processed foods, like some of these deli meats that are highly, highly processed with all kinds of additives that are really bad for you. The way that the nutritional thinking has changed since I wrote Fast Food Nation is it was clear 25 years ago that there was a link between the consumption of fast food and obesity rates. You could just plot the rise of McDonald's on a graph and watch the rise of obesity occur simultaneously. And I thought it was because of the high rates of fat and sugar and salt and the low rates of complex carbohydrates and micronutrients. And that's probably true. But now we have a whole understanding of the microbiome and the ways in which a lot of these food additives, flavor additives, color additives literally affect the gut and then can lead to all kinds. I mean, there's like dozens of different ailments that they're now connecting to the consumption of ultra processed foods, from cancers to heart problems to depression, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, Bobby Kennedy is saying, eat real food, basically ripping off Michael Pollan.
Hmm.
And that's good advice. But, you know, Bobby Kennedy just posted a birthday picture. For his birthday, he didn't have a birthday cake. He had a big slab of like pork chop that he put candles into. And he's recommending that Americans eat more meat, drink more dairy, have more animal fats. And there's a great, brilliant scientist at the Scripps Institute that I follow. And I'd encourage people to follow. He's absolutely brilliant. His name is Eric Topol. He's at the cutting edge of introducing AI into medicine. And his response to Bobby Kennedy was, here are all the scientific studies that have shown the benefits of eating red meat. It was a blank page. And if people want to eat red meat, I believe in freedom, but I don't think you should be eating red meat for its health benefits. Back to how to eat well without going bankrupt. One of the most infuriating things for me since the publication of Fast Food Nation is that an alternative food system has arisen in the last 25 years. It really didn't exist on a large scale 25 years ago. There is now access to organic food, grass-fed beef, sustainably produced, all kinds of really good foods, farmers markets. I mean, the restaurants that you can go to now versus in London versus 25 years ago. But there's one food system for the wealthy and the well-educated, and then there's another food system for everyone else. And one of the things I look at in the back of the book, The New Afterword, is this notion of true cost accounting, which is a kind of a new form of methodology applied to the food system. And there's a lot of food that's very inexpensive when you buy it at the point of sale. But then if you add in the cost of the diabetes and the heart disease that's going to have to be treated later, or the environmental degradation, or the poverty of the workers who produce the food, it's actually much too expensive. So we need government policies that make healthy, good food affordable for everybody as a basic sort of right, in the same way that housing and healthcare and access to education. I mean, if you were to make a list of what I think the basic human rights are, access to healthy food would be one. Housing, you know, healthcare, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to love who you want to love the way you want to love them, etc. And yet instead we have multi-billion-dollar subsidies for all the wrong kinds of foods. I'll just give you one example, and then I'll shut up, and you can ask me another question. In the United States, 100 million acres of farmland are devoted to corn, heavily subsidized. Corn growers get billions of dollars to grow corn. So 100 million acres of corn, that's about the size of California. How much of that is going to be eaten by human beings as corn on the cob, or a can of corn, or corn flour? About 300,000 of those acres goes for the human consumption of corn. And the rest of it goes to animal feed for factory farms, or goes to ethanol to power cars. And when you start looking at, America has incredible, unbelievably productive farmland, and something like 3% of the cropland in the United States is going to the production of fruits, nuts, and vegetables, which really are the foundation of a healthy diet. And this is all a completely distorted system in which massive federal subsidies are essentially subsidizing the big meatpacking companies that are only possible because they have access to insanely cheap grain, soybean, corn. And so, I get back to Marx
He had to come back sometime.
and notions of inevitability. And none of this is inevitable. And if it's not inevitable, you have agency to make it different.
I wanted to ask you about that specifically because at the end of Fast Food Nation, at least the first edition, you write, "The real power of the American consumer has not yet been unleashed. The heads of Burger King, KFC, and McDonald's should feel daunted. They're outnumbered. There are 3 of them and almost 300 million of you. A good boycott, a refusal to buy, can speak much louder than words." And I was reading that, and it struck me as interesting that where we have seen a boycott of these fast food corporations, it's been in support of Gaza, in protest of the genocide. And I'm not saying that's a bad reason to boycott, but why is it that anti-corporate messaging alone hasn't necessarily been that good at galvanizing people to change their consumption habits, but this other kind of political cause, for some reason, has been able to get people to act?
Well, I am hugely grateful to Penguin, which is a big corporation, but which has supported my work for 25 years and never asked me to change a word, and has really allowed me to publish things that challenge conventional thinking. But the marketing budget for my book has just been significantly lower than what McDonald's has to spend. So McDonald's is spending $1 billion a year on marketing its point of view. And if you took every book of the last 25 years challenging this food system, and I've helped to produce 3 or 4 documentaries challenging this food system, and you took all the marketing of all of those and put them together, you probably wouldn't get 2 weeks of McDonald's marketing budget. So in some ways, why hasn't that happened? Because, oh my God, it's not a fair fight in so many ways. At the same time, that potential still exists as we speak because, I can't remember who said it. I'm not sure if it was Edward Abbey. I'm going to get it wrong. But basically, these corporations, it's grow or die. And they constantly need to be increasing their revenues and profits so that you don't have to get 50% of McDonald's customers to not go there next week. If you can get 5% or 10%, that is close to catastrophic. I don't think that the world is going to be changed through consumerism and purchasing decisions. Not when we have sort of, to use, I think, a great phrase that George Monbiot used maybe 25 years ago, which is a captive state, which is essentially, government and corporations completely in alignment. So you can't just shop your way out of this. But I think that there is an enormous potential for boycotts. This past year in the United States, I think there was a right-wing boycott of Bud Light because they used, I think they had...
Dylan Mulvaney.
Yeah. And so it works. In that case, it worked for all the wrong reasons on the wrong side. But there's a need to mobilize. And I mean, I think I might have said this to you before, I'm not presenting myself as the leader of any movement. I am not perfect. I am not pure. I have no reason to be self-righteous. My hope is that my work stimulates thought and provides, it's really kind of a corny, old-fashioned notion, but it really guides so much of my nonfiction writing, which is that knowledge is power. And that's why these big groups that I write about don't want you to know.
And what was it that Lenin said? Read, read, and read some more.
John Lennon?
Ah, no, Vladimir.
Okay.
I want to move on to Reefer Madness, because
Yeah.
when it was published in 2003, the idea that marijuana might be legalized in 24 states for recreational use and 40 for medical use seemed like such an unreal possibility.
If you'd said that, I would say you've been smoking too much weed.
And
I mean, it was
right.
completely an absurd notion. And I'm sorry, continue.
I was going to say, but like, how have corporations muscled in? I mean, what you're seeing in terms of the prevalence of cannabis in the United States, that's not necessarily, small farmers growing their artisanal strains anymore. Like, big tobacco has been like, all right, I can't get people smoking, Lucky Strikes anymore, so here we go.
I spent almost a year immersing myself in the world of marijuana in the United States. And it's not because I have a pot flag up on my wall, and I've definitely smoked pot, but...
Did you inhale?
I not only inhaled, but I held my breath after inhaling. But I mean, I really don't smoke that much pot. And I was interested in it for a lot of reasons. One of it was, the war on drugs and the beginning of mass incarceration, and also the demonization of subgroups. And marijuana was associated first with Mexican immigrants, then with Black jazz musicians, then with the hippie counterculture. And it was just really interesting to see how the powers that be wanted to crush all of those things. And that was my introduction to the American prison system. It was the first time I ever visited a prison. I went into Leavenworth Penitentiary, which is the oldest federal prison, and at the time was a maximum security prison and an incredibly dangerous prison. And I was there to visit a marijuana offender who had never been accused of any violent crime, who had never been accused of selling marijuana, who had never been accused of growing marijuana, but through the war on drugs and the intricacies of federal conspiracy law, had gotten life without parole for his first marijuana crime. And again, that's why it's called reefer madness. And I found again and again people who were getting life without parole for relatively minor marijuana crimes. And the question at the heart of that article was, how does a society come to punish someone more harshly for marijuana than for killing somebody with a gun? I had a friend in college who was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. Um, she had broken up with him. He strangled her to death. He was very well connected socially. He came up with a ridiculous defense in court, which was, she was abusive to him. She was maybe 5'2". He was maybe 6'3", and he wound up serving, I don't know, 16 months in prison for premeditated murder. And here I was at Leavenworth Penitentiary with this hippie biker who I really liked a lot named Mark Young, with life without parole. And if you had told me when I was visiting Mark Young at Leavenworth Penitentiary that within a couple of decades you could go in California to a fancy store and pick out, between 30 to 40 different varieties of cannabis that you could smoke, that you could take as an edible, that you could drink. Again, I would have thought that that was like a Cheech and Chong stone fantasy. At the same time, it's encouraging because it shows that change is possible. I have real misgivings about the way that marijuana is now being marketed and commercialized, and the way
The sort
that
of like gummy bearification of it.
yeah. And I know somebody whose name shall not be mentioned, who was at, and it wasn't me, but I don't want to get them in trouble. Someone I love very much, who was at someone's house, and there was a bowl of chocolate. Just started eating the chocolate. It was fantastic. And it was like high level edible THC chocolate. And I mean, she was stoned for like 2 or 3 days. So should we really be selling a powerful psychoactive drug as a chocolate that children might eat? I mean, it's sort of getting back to the United States. I love my country still, but we go through these wild swings between life without parole for a joint. I mean, I wrote about someone who basically got life without parole for a roach, it's just a fragment of a joint. We go from, we're going to put you in prison for life for a joint to, we're going to sell gummy bear pot and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway.
You're this close to like THC Prime by Logan Paul.
Yeah.
But where does that come from in American culture? Because I was thinking of the Netherlands, where obviously weed's been legal for a really long time, and people might have a bit of a space cake or smoke a joint. Now sort of edible culture is coming to Europe, and I too have friends who have fallen foul of eating the cookies because they tasted really good, and then you're like, Jesus. But it seems to me that America sort of turned weed into fast food, and there was a very short amount of time between the first wave of legalization and this sort of strangely infantilized way of marketing it. What is it about America that can't just be like, sometimes you'll have a joint and that's all right?
Yeah.
Why can't it land there?
I think that, if you go back to the founding of the country, I think that we have two, and that's a lot of what Reefer Madness was ultimately about. We have two hugely divergent, competing cultural trends. We were founded by Puritans who were fleeing religious persecution, but had, very strict, moralistic view of the world. And we were founded by rebels and iconoclasts like Tom Paine, who wrote the seminal document of the American Revolution, Common Sense, who was, anti-monarchist, anti-organized religion, pretty much as radical as you could be in 1776. And so, in the chapter on Reefer Madness that I write about porn, when that book was written, we had some of the most strident, and I'm not talking about the feminist opposition to porn. I'm talking about the religious right-wing opposition to porn. We had powerful, powerful anti-porn movement, and yet we were making more porn, consuming more porn, celebrating porn more than anyone else. So you could describe America at various points in our history as not being a very, very well integrated personality. And that's, I don't want to be humorous about it because there are huge consequences for subgroups. I mean, we genuinely, truly are a nation of immigrants, and I think have achieved a social harmony among hugely, hugely diverse immigrant populations, better than any other country in the world. And yet right now we're in the grips of a periodic anti-immigrant crusade that you can see happened in the Eisenhower administration. There were mass roundups. During the Depression, there were mass roundups of immigrants. In the 1920s, there were incredibly racist legislation. In the 1890s, there were anti-Chinese movements. And so we just swing between these extremes. And right now, we're in a really bad patch. Now, a Marxist might call that the dialectic and the working out of history, but I just see it as the never-ending battle against the forces of darkness.
I mean, on porn, in Reefer Madness, you're writing when online porn is relatively young. Now it's pretty much all there is. And even something like Pornhub is out of date compared to OnlyFans. How has that sort of changed the economics of pornography? Because now, your porn baron isn't really someone like Ruben Sturman.
Yeah.
It's sort of someone whose name you don't know who runs it as a tech company.
Yeah. I'm going to say something to you as an answer for the first time in this interview, and it's sincere. I don't know. Of all the things that I've written, the porn investigation that I did was suggested to me. I'm not prurient, and I believe in free expression, and I have no problems with nudity or sexual expression in art. But my interest in porn personally was minimal. I mean, well, anyway. Well, I was about to say, I was about to use an analogy that I'd much rather play a sport than watch it on TV. In any event, what was interesting to me and seemed most subversive to me was to throw back at these proponents of the free market that here was this commodity that everyone wanted, and yet it was being so strictly kind of regulated and trying, the same people who were advocating on behalf of the free market were trying to ban all of this commodity. And that's the same thing with marijuana. And the porn story is also the story of this one magnate, Ruben Sturman, who, I had no idea that there was a single person who controlled the porn industry, not only in the United States, but overseas throughout the world as well. And I thought that his story was a quintessentially American story of empire building, but as the original title was, an empire of the obscene. And so, and I think I said this to you before we started doing the interview, that the book Reefer Madness is a collection of three major investigative pieces, one on porn, one on pot, and one on the exploitation of migrant farm workers. And I tried, as my first book, I tried very hard to write a book on farm workers in America based on my experience following the harvest, and nobody would give me a book contract to write about farm workers. So I managed, if you look at the structure of the book, to start out with pot, and then put the farm workers in the middle, and if you wanted to get to the porn, you'd have to read
I
through
was
the
like,
whole
wait
thing.
a minute.
Now, I'm sure there are some people who skip the farm workers to get straight to the porn. But, back to even Upton Sinclair, it's so hard to get people to care about the exploitation of immigrant workers. It's just a fact. And so Upton Sinclair, as a socialist, really wrote that book to expose the plight of Eastern European immigrants in Chicago.
This was The Jungle.
The Jungle. And, the real effect, and it was one of the most, it had probably the fastest social impact of any book in American history, maybe Uncle Tom's Cabin in bringing to light the cruelties of slavery, but it led to our first food safety legislation. And that's not why he wrote the book. I mean, he had descriptions of horrible contaminated food coming out of the slaughterhouses.
Man being turned into lard.
Man being turned into lard, and, and rats and everything like that. And he later said that, I aimed for people's hearts and I hit them in the stomach. And, even right now in the United States, as undocumented immigrants and even immigrants who are fully legal are being terrorized, it's a real challenge to get people to see that there, but for the grace of God, go I, and that could be you next week. And you should have compassion regardless, but the sort of making clear the connections between, the people who are being rounded up and who might be rounded up next.
I've got one last question for you, and it is about undocumented migrants.
Yeah.
Considering the tenor of the political conversation about undocumented migrants, where illegal immigrant is basically used as a synonym for violent, criminal, rapist.
Alien.
But
using the word alien isn't dehumanizing at all.
No. I mean, you're going to be like, you think you were the only ones who introduced an Illegal Aliens Act? Like, we had that in the 19th century. Purely the offspring of the Mother Empire. But that being the tenor of the political conversation, what's something you learned in your research and your work with undocumented immigrants that you think would be most surprising to your average voter?
I spent time with strawberry pickers who were living in the hillsides of northern San Diego County. And they basically were digging caves into a hillside and covering where they slept at night with garbage bags and tarp so that they would be hidden from immigration authorities who might be looking for them. Sleeping outdoors, walking to the fields, working 10 to 12 hours a day in the fields, in hot sun, to send money back to their families in Oaxaca or Chiapas in Mexico. I have spent time with meatpacking workers in Texas and Colorado and Washington and Nebraska who are doing literally one of the most dangerous jobs in the United States in some of the most awful working conditions you can imagine, risking their health to support their families. And to depict these people in any way as a threat to the well-being of middle-class Americans, of mainstream Americans, is a perversion. It's a disgrace. And the people who are being demonized deserve our gratitude and a living wage and a safe working conditions and health care. And that's something that I've been fighting for 30 years. And, when I have spent, and I used this phrase earlier, but I really mean it, I have spent time among the poorest, most exploited workers in the United States, and it has left me feeling there, but for the grace of God. you cannot control who your parents were, what circumstances you were born into, et cetera. And I'll end with this. This was from the Atlantic article. I wrote an Atlantic article that really looked at the explicit racism behind the law that is now being used to criminalize immigrants in the United States. And these were laws passed in the 1920s aimed at Spanish-speaking immigrants. And I mean, they're racial theory, horrible stuff. But there was one statistic that I found from a study that really amused me. And it was about, these immigrants are being portrayed as murderers and rapists and thieves. Trump is constantly talking about all their crimes. And the reality is, and it's irrefutable, that immigrants and recent immigrants and undocumented immigrants commit violent crimes at a much, much lower rate, far lower rate than people who were born in the United States. And so at one point in the piece, I said something like, the state of Texas would be a lot safer if you deported all the people born in Texas. And if you just left Texas to the immigrants and the undocumented immigrants, there'd be a lot less crime.
Eric Schlosser, thank you so much for joining us on
Thank you.
Downstream.